Hello and welcome back to another painting video. For this folktale landscape I have chosen sort of an idyllic landscape in autumn, and if you take a look at the reference later you can see that I tweaked the colors quite a bit. I decided to render this scene with really a lot of warm colors. I wanted everything to feel really peaceful and idyllic looking, and my idea behind this was that maybe there's something hidden behind these, golden fields and this little sleepy town. Maybe there's something going on there, and we have to find out by spending time in the painting and by looking at the painting. So that was my idea for this one. As always, I'm starting with my pencil sketch here. I've speeded things up quite a bit because I have started with such light lines that you can't actually see a lot of them. So I'm going from very light and loose lines to more detailed rendering of the scene in pencil. And this is an approach that I recently tried out and I'm quite liking it. So I'm actually spending more time on the drawing for this sketch, getting a very detailed drawing in. And since I'm using watercolor for this painting, you will see some of the lines in the final painting. So this was my technical approach for this painting. And you see I'm taking my time rendering the bush and this power line, which I wanted to feature quite prominently in the sky, and the field in the foreground. That adds a lot to the calm atmosphere of this sketch, really. So I'm making sure I get all the details right, and in the end, before I started painting, I added another layer of shadowing and just these kind of cross-hatching, and you will see in a second. There it is. And now I can start painting. I like to start with the sky. I'm using ultramarine blue, this beautiful bright sky. And I'm thinking, since there are a few clouds, I'm thinking of breaking up this blue area with a few white spots. Since I'm working in watercolor, I really have to think about where do I want the whites to be, because I can't paint them back in. I want to use the paper white for this. I'm tilting my painting board a little bit so that gravity can do its thing here. And then I'm painting the rest of the clouds with a much more diluted paint mix so that they look softer and farther away. And I try to keep everything really loose. I don't want to fiddle too much. I want these clouds to look as natural as they can. I'm going over some areas for a second time with a bit more pigment and a bit more water so that everything looks really loose and I don't have any hard edges. And I also introduce a little bit of gray for the bottom of the clouds. And as long as these areas are wet, everything will blend nicely together and leave no hard edges. So I'm letting the sky dry, and I'm starting with the back of the field with a very light mix of yellow ochre, and I'm intensifying it a little bit in the foreground. Since I want a darker color there, there's a bit of shadow, as you can also see in the reference. And I'm adding these loose brush strokes to indicate that there's a change in texture in the front of the field where the field meets the grass. So from time to time I'm dropping in a bit more pigment, this yellow ochre color, and then I'm also adding purple for the shadowy area of this edge of the field, and this will give a nice contrast. It will show that this area is in shadow, and it will also work as a complementary contrast for the yellow. So these two colors will intensify by putting them close together. And I'm painting this with these small brush strokes, with these small motions next to each other to show that there's a lot of structure going on, a lot of texture. I don't just want to paint a big area filled with solid color. I want to keep these options so that I can add more of this grass texture later. I'm building up the field layer by layer blending in the purple and the yellow ochre a bit, and then adding a few of these textural strokes. I'm working on the trees in the back with this mix of gold green and a little bit of sap green. And I have to say, I really love this pigment. It really transports the amount of sunlight and of glow that I want to achieve in this painting. So a lot of things that went right in this sketch are due to the gold green. Adding a few blobs of color here and there for more background trees and background meadows. And I don't want these tree areas to blend together too much, so I want them to stand apart and to be a bit separate. So I'm taking care to let these darker and lighter and greener and yellower areas not to blend together too much. So basically I want to stay true to the pencil sketch. You can see I'm following it quite closely. This darker green that I'm using here is probably Perylene green. I actually don't remember, but Perylene green is nice for these sort of background hills or shadowy areas, or also spruces. And in addition to the gold green, I really like the combination of these two pigments. I'm filling in more white areas with different green shades. Some are more yellowish, some are greener. And I will even add a little bit of red for the roofs in the little town that is in the middle of the sketch. Right now I'm going for these very diluted paint mixes, very light mixes, so that I just have a decent background color that I can work with later. Let's talk about the brush that I use for a minute. It's a Raphael Soft Aqua, and I have to say I really like it. I don't get paid by the company for any of this, but I have discovered these, they have these synthetic brushes for watercolor, and I really like the quality of brush strokes that you get out of them. So they don't have a really sharp pointed tip, but they rather have this sort of this rounded tip that works nice for this sort of landscape work. So I'm adding more and differently colored background trees, and I'm adding a bit more depth or a bit more shadow to this group of trees in the midground here. And so bit by bit I'm closing up these white areas where the paper still shines through. I'm leaving the background alone for a minute, and I'm starting to work on these foreground grasses and the structures. I'm keeping my brush strokes really in the spirit of my earlier application of brush strokes. So I'm trying to imagine the single grass blades and the single plants. And for the immediate foreground, I'm adding a very light layer of green. So this is a sap green mixed with a little bit of yellow or a little bit of gold green here. I don't want this to be too prominent because I'll be adding detail on top of it. And now for the bush in the foreground, I chose to bring out the gray color of this bush a bit more, so to set it apart from the rest of the field and the rest of the scene. And I'm thinking about the branches and the twigs, and I'm not just slapping on paint to color in the area of the bush. So I'm really thinking about which direction does my brush stroke need to be, and what areas are maybe darker, what are in shadow, and what areas will be hit by light. So I'm also blending this a little bit with the purple that I used earlier, and now I'm adding a few interesting brush strokes to bring out the grasses in the foreground. And I'm also introducing more intense colors in the foreground. So this is a good rule of thumb to remember for painting landscapes, to keep your colors more intense in the foreground and then slowly change them, dilute them to the background to simulate this effect of having atmospheric haze. I'm also adding shadows behind these tufts of grass. And I hope I'm not repeating myself, but I try to keep everything really loose, so not to overwork anything. You can see I have added a bit more purple for the shadow area of the meadow. And now I'm starting to dot in these little details, these little flower heads or whatever they are. And if you find you've added too much color, too much paint, then you can just blot this away with a cloth, as long as it's still wet. So this will take some of the color away again. Sometimes I just use my finger. And bit by bit I'm starting to enter the infamous detail stage of the painting, where I just add bits of detail after detail after detail, and this stage can be really long. It can also be hard to stop. But right now I think I'm still in the green zone. The whole painting still looks a bit unfinished to me, and so some extra detail cannot hurt. So I'm working a bit on the branches and the twigs of this bush in the foreground, taking into account what kind of lighting situation is going on. So I don't want the top left to be too dark, but I want some shadows in near the ground. And since it's autumn, there is some of the meadow will shine through, some of the golden tone of the meadow. I also find that overall the meadow is still a bit too light, so I add a very thin layer of yellow ochre and spread it around. So now that looks already a lot better, and it also brings back the focus to these parts of the meadow. I add a few branches with colored pencil, and I'm also restating the really fine lines of the power line here. So I think this adds a really interesting touch to the sketch, because it's a symbol of modern times, and so I find that these folktale landscapes that I'm looking for these stories can also take place in more modern landscapes or contemporary landscapes. So we don't have to go to the past for these sort of stories. Adding a little bit more shadow around the middle ground, around these parts of the meadow. So this is diluted perylene green or sap green. And I'm restating some of these little details in the foreground also. And one of the most important things about this painting are the red roofs of the little houses in the town for me. So I want them to really stand out, and they also have a nice contrast to the trees. I'm re-wetting some of the trees on the left because I want a bit more color to float around there. So I'm just adding these dots of orange, and that makes the trees more luminous. Now I'm bringing out my light colored pencil and I'm adding more texture to the foreground. These single grass tufts can use a bit more work, and I find that the colored pencil isn't strong enough for what I'm trying to do, so I get out my brush with a little bit of white gouache warmed up with just a tiny bit of yellow ochre, so that it appears to be a warm white and not a cool white. So on its own, these whites, these gouache whites, always appear slightly cool. I'm just smoothing everything out again, and that's the entire sketch. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoyed the sort of my thinking behind the story and what I want to convey with this landscape, because for me that's always at the center of why I do a painting and why I choose a certain landscape to sketch. As always, feel free to comment, like and subscribe. You can learn more about this folktale landscape project in my other videos or on my blog. And thank you for watching, and I'll see you again very soon. Bye!